But here we are, Greg, finally.
Hey, Dave. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. My story with you may not know when that began, but years ago when I was, in college, essentially, starting out my journey with architecture and construction, I reached out to a local firm by the name of Wise Surma Jones, and I got I had been researching a way to kind of get your foot in the door with architects, and there was this idea of informal interviews. Like, hey, I'm not looking for a job. I'm not looking for really anything other than your input. And I had sat with Kit.
Yep, Kit Wise.
Kit Wise.
Yep.
And you guys were downtown, New Bedford. And so it was great. He gave me a lot of insight into, like the path to becoming an architect. And you were partners with
Kit is still working. He's I think Kit turned 75 or 76.
Wow.
And he's still at it. He loves it. So
he's still at it, right?
Yep.
And I think I spoke to, is it Surma?
And Anna Surma was
Surma.
the third partner, yes.
Third partner,
She retired, it's got to be 10 years ago now.
So I reached out to her maybe 5 years ago, and she informed me of that. And then you went out essentially on your own, or branched off essentially. And I've been seeing your work over the years. A lot of great projects. You're one of the guys that that I've seen in the area designing really great shingle style.
Sure.
What we call custom homes.
Yes. So I had gotten started. My wife and I are both architects. We went to school in Syracuse, got our degrees, moved to Boston, worked in Boston for a number of years, found our way down to New Bedford, bought our first house there.
Right.
And for a while, we commuted back to Boston for a couple of years. And then I started doing moonlighting work for what used to be a company called Design and Conservation.
Okay.
And it was Kit Wise, Anna Surma, and a woman named Carol Nelson.
Carol Nelson.
So the three of them had this practice in downtown New Bedford called Design and Conservation, doing mostly custom residential stuff and a lot of historic preservation in New Bedford. So I would do moonlighting, drafting for them and a couple of the companies in the area, so I wouldn't have to commute to Boston.
Okay.
And over the years, 3 years worth, I was doing more and more drafting for Design and Conservation, and as well as a company in Providence. And the Providence company wanted me to go to them full time. And it was a pretty good offer, so I talked to the folks back in New Bedford, and they said, well, why don't you come on board as a partner here and stay? So for me, it was a great opportunity to get my foot in the door for a business that had a good clientele already.
Right.
It was called Design and Conservation at the time, and then Carol retired, and it was Kit Wise, Anna Surma, and we were trying to come up with a name. So it became Wise Surma Jones Architects. And we bought a building on Center Street in New Bedford. Yep. Beautiful old historic.
That's where I went.
Yep.
Right.
Beautiful old historic house in New Bedford. Still love New Bedford. And we did the historic preservation work. By then had sort of dried up. We had done the Grace Church. We did Grinnell Mansion. We did the Rodman Mansion restorations. But we then branched out into mostly custom residential stuff.
Right.
And we had been doing a lot of public work, but all three of us got burned out with the public bid process and the sort of hoops you have to go through to get that work. And then once you get it, it's always the low bidder.
Right.
And it's very difficult work.
Yeah.
So as the residential stuff grew, that's what we focused on.
Gotcha. And we also, we got to know each other kind of interestingly how that went about with our struggles with some local municipalities, and kind of fighting for what was right for our clients. And we kind of, unified there as well, which is great. It's how we really started our kind of communication and our relationship. And you branched off into the, I don't want to go too far into that subject because we touched on it yesterday on another podcast, and it's, all good things came out of it.
Yes.
The work you put into it, the work our company put into it, and we've made some change in the local Dartmouth community.
Things are much better.
Much better. There's room for improvement, but we'll definitely. I know you'll be there with me on the forefront to drive that change. And one of the first questions I had here was describe your journey into architecture, which you did. But what initially sparked that?
So I was a kid. I grew up on Long Island in New York, and once you get out of middle school, I guess, you either go to the local academic high school or you can go to a vocational high school. And similar to New Bedford, my area of Long Island had a very good vocational high school called Sewanhaka. Tough name, Sewanhaka. That was the cheerleaders. So it was Sewanhaka High School. And if you decide you want to go there, you've got to select, some course that you want to study. So
right.
it was for me, it was either going to be automotive repairs and maintenance or building technology. And I like the car stuff. I've always liked cars, but that had already filled up. So the fallback was building design and technology, or architectural drafting and technology, I think it was called. So I started out in Evoke High School,
right.
Doing drafting and, pretty basic design stuff, some structural engineering. And I found I enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
So while it wasn't my first choice, I did enjoy it.
An interest.
And the school was very good. I managed to hook up at the time with an engineer who was a land surveyor, so I had a part-time job doing that. So I would get in the field quite a bit, and I would see these buildings get built, which was interesting.
Right.
And in school, I would do the drafting and stuff. And of course, once you graduate high school, I knew at the time there's really not a big market anymore for draftsmen.
Right.
Back in the old days, in the 50s and 60s, there would be rooms full of just draftspeople drafting things, because this was before computers and all that.
Those pictures you see of a bunch of guys laying on top of tables.
Asses and elbows.
Asses.
That was my high school drafting teacher's mantra. If he saw too many people sort of talking with each other, he said, all I want to see is asses and elbows. And sure, if you were small like me, you'd be climbing up on the drafting table to do your thing. So I decided, well, let's continue this beyond just drafting. So decided to go to Syracuse University in their architectural program. And at the time, I didn't realize to get a degree, a Bachelor of Architecture, you've got to go for 5 years. It's a 5-year degree. Of course, my parents didn't like hearing that, because that means 5 years worth of college tuitions. So I ended up going to Syracuse School of Architecture, and that's where I met my wife. Mm-hmm. Graduated with a degree in architecture. And I still liked it, and all through that time I worked either in the field, actually digging in-ground swimming pools for 2 years, and then the last 3 years I managed to get a part-time job with an architectural firm there.
Right.
And they were in a little different sort of business model than what I have. They did a lot of production houses like ranches and center entrance colonials, so they would have a file of stock houses. And my job was to sort of modify them. Right. What a client wanted, I like this house, but I want this bathroom or this door moved. So my job was to just do that. So it wasn't terribly design challenging.
Which we do a lot of that in our company. Yeah. People see plans online, and we want to make a new version of that. Yep. And
there's a big market for that. And this firm, that's pretty much what they did exclusively. And like I say, I enjoyed it. I didn't get to go in the field. That was one thing that I missed, because you couldn't see the things getting built, which is, I think, in order to be successful at this on the architectural side, I think you have to have a good sense of how stuff gets put together.
Absolutely.
I'm sure as a builder you can appreciate that.
Well, yeah, being on both sides, design and build, throughout my whole career, I've seen the builders on site when I used to sell building materials and be kind of like the fly on the wall. I'm neither the builder or the designer, or architect, and just see how sometimes the builder would try to dumb things down, or vice versa, where the architect or designer didn't have a grasp of the real world and would kind of come off ignorant to the builder. So I've seen it from that perspective, and I've been on both sides as well too. So I can definitely appreciate that point of view, and obviously the custom home world, where you're designing maybe something from scratch versus an existing home plan that you're going to modify. There's definitely creativity in both, but there's a lot more in the starting from scratch scenario. This brings me to a question here. How do you balance creativity and functionality when designing a new building or space?
It's a challenge, because, clients want certain things, whether it's a room of a certain size or a number of bedrooms, bathrooms, and they also have an image in their mind of what they want their house to look like. And I find the biggest challenge, I can usually get the floor plan put together pretty quickly that meets the client's needs and has the right flow and the right size, but then trying to marry it to an elevation that they like or exterior view that they like. To me, that's the biggest challenge because I get asked a lot. People bring in pictures, and most of my work generally is traditional looking architecture. So people will bring in pictures. One of the favorites of clients was an older architect who's since passed called Royal Barry Wills. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No, I haven't heard.
So he was around in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and he did a lot of Cape-style homes on waterfronts, big rambling things, beautiful homes, nice interiors, and they looked like, a Currier and Ives picture, just beautiful things.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with them is they always had low ceilings.
Okay.
They always had dormers on the second floor, so the bedrooms always had sort of neat
Sloped.
roof lines and slopes and stuff. Most clients nowadays want high ceilings.
Right.
They don't want little dormers. They want huge dormers because they're looking out at some view of the water or
Right.
a forest or a field. So you try and marry this image of
Right.
this.
The floor plan and then this front elevation, essentially, in simple
try
terms.
and make them work.
The two don't always line up.
Right. So it's, for me, the scariest moment, and I just went through this with a client, was I get all the information from a client and their pictures and their what they'd love to have, and I put together a set of drawings. And now everything's on the computer, so when I send the first sketches to a client, it always looks like a finished product.
Right.
And they get this thing, and my fear is they freak out because they think because it's all precisely drawn on the computer that this is the answer.
Uh-huh.
And I try and tell them beforehand, if this is their first time doing this, this really is nothing more than a computer equivalent of a freehand sketch.
Gotcha.
So don't take it too seriously. It's not set in stone. It's meant as the first sort of entree into, here's what I've come up with. Let's talk about what do you like about it? What don't you like about it?
Right.
But try and keep in mind, it's really just a sketch.
Right.
It's just a concept. So
That form and function, that's that balance. And I was watching a show last night about one of the houses that Frank Lloyd Wright designed.
Mm-hmm.
I forget the name of the house, but the presenter was talking about compression and release, where like you enter like a foyer and it's a tight, and he did this a lot, like tight, compact spaces, lower ceilings, very narrow hallways, and then it would open up, release into these
Yes.
great rooms.
You go,
And that's I was discussing how that reminds me of when they say architecture is art, right? But it's art that you can experience from within.
Yeah.
So you're inside that space, and if you're a great architect, great designer, can really play with that psychology. And but at the end of the day, your client's paying the bills,
Yes.
so you have to get them what they want, their wish list.
Yep.
So no, it's great to hear how everyone has those struggles in that field where you gotta get them what they want, but you gotta marry those elevations, you gotta marry those styles together. So
and the budget.
and the budget, right?
Yeah.
Of course.
Sooner or later, they ask how much is all this going to cost. And no matter who the client, I think in 36 years of doing this, I've only had one client where really money was no object. So the question of cost never came up. But every other client I've had, they can be very wealthy. They still want to know, what is it going to cost at the end of the day?
Right, of course. Yeah.
So that's
Budget, right?
Yeah, there's always a budget.
That annoying
Yeah.
thing called the budget.
Yeah. And if you can justify it of why you've got to do it this way, that's one thing. And sometimes they'll say, okay, I'll spend the extra money. Or
Right.
sometimes they'll say, no, it's just not worth it to me. It may be worth it to Greg Jones as the architect because it's, I don't know,
Inspiring.
something
right?
inspiring.
Right.
But to them, it may not be that critical. So
Well,
you've got to give it up.
For us as builder, we rarely, the projects are always over budget because the designs, when we get them, the details aren't developed. So, when we're in the pricing phase and when the other bidders are in pricing phase, there's so many unknowns. The plans tend to be very bland, don't have much called out. So we have to provide allowances for, many of the
Sure.
products in there. So, and some of those don't get ironed out until we're in construction. So it's a frustrating place to be because I would prefer to work with an architect and then as a builder provide a pre-construction agreement where we're working with the architect to really budget and develop all the finishes as close as possible. So when we do get to the permitting construction phase, we have a lot closer picture to the budget realistically. But tends to be, I don't know if it's this area or at least the clientele that I've been exposed to. They're just not open to it. Some don't even want to hire an architect.
Right.
They just want to print plans off the computer and go to town.
And I mean, there's a place for that. But I would say in the past 10 years, I've tried to steer clients away from the bid it to 4 or 5 contractor model. And my reasoning for it, there's a couple reasons. One is it takes a long time for an architect to get every single detail nailed down and put on a set of drawings, from the moldings to the material you're using on your floor to the kitchen cabinets you want exactly. That all takes time for the clients to decide, and then for the architect, whether it's me or somebody else, to get it all drawn up. I mean, we're talking months on a custom home to do that. And then to send it out to bid to contractors, these days you're looking at least 6 weeks to get numbers back from 4, maybe 5 contractors, if you can find contractors that are willing to bid.
Right.
Because once COVID hit, now that's 5 years ago almost, building went crazy. Everybody was building.
Right.
No builder was going to sit down for a 40-hour period to precisely bid a project,
right,
because they had so much work to do that was falling in their offices. So I have tried, and most of the time I've been successful in getting clients to have me do a set of, I would say, 30% drawings.
Okay.
Then pick 2 contractors that I may be familiar with or they may be familiar with. Sit down with each of them, ask them to come up with a budget based on those drawings. Now that budget can be a budget range of 15%. It's going to be 800 to 1.2 million, just pulling numbers out of air.
Right.
And if both the builders come back with a similar range, then you know that that's sort of what it's going to cost. And if you're comfortable with that, then we say, okay, now we need to pick one of those guys. And you may choose them based on personality, based on the quality of their work, based on their work schedule. When can they get this in? And then from that point on, they work with me and the client together to flesh out the details, the moldings. Right. And we've got the builder on board. He knows he's got a job here. His subs are more willing then to sit down with us and go through the electric needs, the plumbing needs, and come up with a real number for that.
Right.
And there's somebody on board besides me, the architect, that's going to raise their hand and say, geez, you just picked the most expensive kitchen cabinets they make. That's going to be out of that budget range we talked about. Do you want to reconsider, or do you want to come up with the extra money? And then I find that model is much more successful in getting everybody happy.
Right.
It doesn't always work. I'm doing a project now where we have 4 bidders, competitive bid, because the client really wants that. My fear with that is, particularly in the last several years, construction costs have fluctuated so much that lumber yards, window suppliers, they're not going to hold their numbers for 30 or 60 days while you go through a bid process. So I can tell a client, this custom house, based on projects I've done recently, you're looking at $400 a square foot. And they say, okay, let's get going. Well, by the time I'm done, the bidders are done, maybe it's $450 a square foot or $500, because prices have changed so dramatically. Makes a big difference. And then we get all these bid numbers in, and they're all above the budget.
Right.
And then everybody's upset. And, the client's upset, the builders are upset because they spent all this time and there may not be a project out of it. And then I've got to go back to the client and say, okay, if you want to take 10% out of this or 15%, where's that going to come from? What do you want to take out? And by then they've invested emotion into this stuff.
It's hard.
And
it's a hard conversation.
Difficult.
And I always say, and I wonder if you agree, but it's either scale or finishes. So you either got to scale it down, or you got to scale down your finishes.
Yep.
And I'm sure even with that back and forth that you have, you're not talking to them about what specific marble they're going to choose, what slab. You're not talking to them about what valves they're going to use in the shower per se. To give you an example, recently we had a project, we have an ongoing project now where we had like $2,500 allowance for plumbing fixtures. It's a very basic, fixtures for shower valves, for, sink fixtures. And, the client went to the local supply house and then the supply house sent us the invoice, the quote per se, what client picked, and it was like $32,000. Yes. And I'm like, yeah. So it's like you don't know till they go pick.
Right.
And so they really focus in on that. And it's very rare for an architect to be part of that process.
I mean, there are times like that one client where money was really no object. We would pick out plumbing fixtures.
Okay.
We'd go to the marble place and pick out slabs, so they'd set them aside.
Right.
But we had one builder, so he was part of the process too.
Part of the process too. Yeah, we have a person dedicated, a project coordinator for selections, essentially, and soliciting bids. But the primary role is providing the customer that milestone to make those decisions, but what the budget is as well that we've set forth. But it's still a struggle because, it's not just in my world. I listen to other, I'm part of an association. I listen to other builders, talk about their struggles, and this is the most common one. Rarely does a residential construction project ever come in on budget.
Yeah.
Maybe commercial because a lot more spelled out. You're using these toilets, you're using these fixtures, you're using these dividers, everything's figured out, so most of it can be priced. And now I believe a lot of architects are using it's a BIN or building information modeling.
Yeah.
Where it's
BIM,
BIM. So as you're designing the building, essentially, it's generating material lists, product pricing, and everything. I mean, I'm not in that world.
Yeah, I actually don't do that, and a couple clients have asked me to do that, but I really don't want to get in the pricing end of this stuff.
I don't blame you.
There's just too much change, too many. I don't want to be responsible for the costs of some things. I do want the client to know what stuff costs, but I don't want to be the guy driving that train. They've got to make those sorts of selections.
But we also, like as a builder, I want to say, all right, here's a foundation price. We got bids and we're on budget, but here's an opportunity. Do you want to do an advanced, treatment on the foundation, like a tough and dry system,
go
or
to waterproofing instead of
waterproofing, or different things like that? Yes, it's going to add 20% or 15% to your foundation price, but I don't want to avoid those conversations either. I want to still provide the client those opportunities and not forget about that. But I don't want to come in. I know a lot of other builders will be like, well, I only build a certain way, and I'm this much per square foot, and there's really no compromise. And I don't see a value in that right now in my career, but maybe some point when I'm picking and choosing more. Maybe that's how that comes with that territory. But for now, I'm willing to say, hey, listen, I can build for you at economically to code, and I can offer you some advanced building systems if the budget allows for, if you so choose. That's on the technical side, but then like we're talking about selection side, it's such a wild card.
Yeah.
It's such a wild card. We have to build the code. We know that.
It was crazy during COVID, the worst, when, literally days prices would change on everything from 2x4s to sheets of plywood for over $100. And,
I lost a lot during that, to keep my name. I took big losses for lumber, specifically lumber. That was the big one. And then from there, it came back down to where it is today, which is back to normal pricing.
Pretty normal.
But everyone else went up. All the sub trades.
Oh yeah, because once the subs got a pay increase during COVID, you can't ask them to give that up.
Right.
The material prices may come down, but labor prices are not going to come down.
Right.
That's why we're still seeing, on the custom end, really, I'm shocked when I sit down with clients and I give them a budget square foot number. And 15 years ago, I would quote $150 a square foot for a custom house.
Right.
And now you can't get a builder spec anything for anywhere near that money.
No way. North of 400 for sure.
And I do a lot of work on the other side of the bridge on the Cape. And you start at $500 or $600 a square foot for custom stuff because the labor over there is significantly higher than the labor here.
Absolutely.
Even though it's just a bridge away.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. Organically, we're answering a lot of these questions and almost in order. One that stands out here that we haven't really talked about. What are some of the common misconceptions people have about the role of an architect?
Well, the role, I guess, a lot of people don't really. New clients that have never worked with architects before don't really know what we do.
Right.
And they're quite often shocked at how much we cost when we explain to them what we do.
Right.
And again, there's different models of architects and what they provide. But a lot of people are surprised that I required to stay in the project until it's done.
Yeah, we've talked about
Yeah,
this,
so
how you like that.
Yeah, so they're surprised when I say, yeah, I stay throughout from the design end, the initial consultations, through when you turn the key and walk into the finished product.
That's great.
And it's not so much to ride herd on the builders.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, I like to see how things are built. I like to see, if walking through these job sites under construction, sometimes something dawns on me to change something that didn't occur to me when I was doing the drawings. And I like to be able to call the client and say, hey, why don't we consider doing it a little differently than what the drawings show? Because you'll get X, Y, or Z.
Right.
But there have been occasions, a couple of clients say, well, I don't, and this was probably a little earlier in my career when I wasn't quite as established, where a client said, well, I don't want to pay you for the construction observation end of things. So I would say, okay. And I had a client where they built the place and, 2 or 3 years go down and go by and they've been living in it and there's some cracks in the ceiling and they call me back and they want to know, what's going on.
Yep.
And I realized at that point, I had made assumptions that the thing was built the way the drawing showed, but who knew until you start taking it apart, only to find out, well, they didn't put in something, a header,
Right.
that was supposed to be put in.
Supposed to be put in.
And, that was a hard lesson for me to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Not that when I go to job sites when they're under construction, I'm going to pick up everything. But I had no clue what was going on in that house and why it was having some issues. So now I do insist that, I stay through the end of the project. And the reality is it represents a small percent of my total fee, maybe 5 or 6%.
Right. It's
So
very
not
reasonable.
It's not a lot of money in the big picture. It gives me peace of mind, and I think it gives the client some peace of mind.
It
too.
does, because like in commercial construction, it's required.
It's required, exactly.
Controlled
And there's a reason
construction,
for that.
and there's milestone inspections, and in some cases, the municipality, for many that don't know, the building inspectors in some of those instances don't even inspect until maybe a final inspection or the initial plan review. So the architect or registered design professional is essentially in
the person
charge
responsible.
and is going to sign affidavits
Yep.
stating that you inspected the work. So it's baked into that commercial process. But in residential construction, it's not common at all. But being part of that controlled construction side with engineers and architects I've collaborated in the past, I've seen when you walk through, mistakes that get caught in that process.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a general contractor, when our framer is done and we do our own framing punch list that we walk through the properties, most of the time there's all kinds of things that are left, undone. Hangers, wrong beam was put in place, improper posts in certain locations, not following loads to the foundation, a lot of things like that. So it's definitely a valuable service you offer.
The side benefit that I've found over the years is if you go on site and you walk through with whether it's the framer or the foundation guy or even the excavators, I learn stuff every trip.
Mm-hmm.
And you get to build a rapport with all these guys.
Right.
And, a lot of my work comes from word of mouth from contractors or subs because they say, hey, he actually cares about what's going on. He comes to the job site.
But you have the right
person,
right? But you have the right attitude because a different architect that comes on a job site can approach that differently, right?
Well, when
they can come with a maybe what you've heard. I'm sure you've heard of like the I'm above you attitude, or so it's all in your approach. So if your approach is very collaborative and open, and that goes a long way, and that's why you're getting referrals.
When we were in school, it was almost drilled into you that the architect is the boss, the builder is less. I don't quite know how to put it, and that they were the bad guys.
Right.
So I got out of school, and I think because I was working part-time during school, and I would meet contractors and subs and all the trades, they're not really the bad guys. I mean,
no,
they want to do a good job.
I think somewhere, correct me if I'm wrong, I've seen a definition of it as Webster, but architect, I believe the definition of the word architect is master builder.
Right. So back to Frank Lloyd Wright, in his day, you were more commonly the master builder.
Right.
And some of these huge mansions in Rhode Island, the architects, at least famous to us architects, they were considered master builders. And they had a sense of how things went together, and they literally were the top dog.
And I think that it's like almost interchangeable. Not no disrespect to your role or the role of a builder. Both are licensed, both have their path to get where they get. The architect's path is much more difficult. I know because I attempted personally to become a licensed architect. So I know what's required, the schooling, the intern development programs, the testing, versus when I got my construction license. It was a lot easier path. But it's almost interchangeable, whereas once you get past that and you're on that playing field of site, you could have a really, really great builder and you could have a subpar designer. Maybe he's not even an licensed architect, or even if he is a licensed architect, but that builder really understands not only conceptually, I've seen it, like design, artistic side, and obviously the mechanics of building, and that designer, architect doesn't really get it,
Right.
So I almost feel like that master builder can almost float between the two roles.
Absolutely, yeah.
And vice versa. I mean, I've met some architects that they get the whole process. They could put a tool belt on and they could start framing the house themselves if they had to.
I tell you, framers, I have utmost respect for good framers, because we draw stuff, whether it's a circle, octagon, hip roof. It's one thing to draw it, and then it's a whole nother thing to understand how to make the cuts and put it together so it looks
Absolutely.
like the picture. So there's a few framers I work with that when I know they're on the job, I know we're in good hands.
In good hands, absolutely. And I mean, we've been part of some pretty technical details, radial and conical details that we've had to draw and work with an engineer to, develop these custom headers and custom, connections that have never been, used before. So I know, although you might have a great framer, you still, a lot of cases, if you don't detail the plans accurately enough, they're left to guess a lot more out there and probably cursing you. Well, where's the details? They just drew it, left us out here to,
Figure
to
it
cook.
out.
Yeah. So, so now it's definitely like the master builder is what I've always kind of heard, is like the definition of an architect. So I don't, when I approach every interaction is it's collaborative. It's
I found that those are the best projects. And knock on wood, because I've known a lot of builders over the years now, I generally only work on projects with contractors that I've worked with before, because I know what they are capable of. I know that they'll pick up the phone when they've got an issue and call me.
They're not going to put you out to dry and be like, oh, he should have did this, and back to the client. Where
it's a team. I mean,
it's a team.
You approach it as a team, the client, the contractor, the architect. For everybody, it works out better.
Right, absolutely. How do you stay up to date with like trends or advancements in architecture? What's your sources?
I tell you, the one disadvantage, one of the disadvantages of being located where we are down on the South Coast is there's really no big resource to go to for like up in Boston when my wife and I lived there. There were a lot of seminars, because the American Institute of Architects is sort of our trade association. So they would have all these seminars to keep everybody abreast of the latest and greatest in the building industry. So when we lived there, we could participate more easily because all the sessions were up in Boston somewhere.
Right.
So once we moved down here, we would trek back up to Boston for these things. But I don't do that anymore. So I do miss that aspect of it, the sort of teamwork that when you meet other architects or specialists that are on the cutting edge of things.
Right.
So, right now it's mostly internet stuff. So there are webinars that I attend on the computer. It's not the same as it used to be when you could go physically in person. I try and stay on top of that. I think the biggest thing that pushes me these days are the building codes, to stay on top of the current building codes. And the newest one is the energy code that we've all been confronted with, and has become exponentially more difficult to pass in the last 6 months.
The plywood now, or the wall construction.
The wall construction, the insulation, the standards you have to meet. So a lot of folks aren't aware of it, but a new house now, you have to put together what's called a HERS rating, home energy rating system. So we have consultants that you send your initial drawings to, and they go through a calculation, and you have to meet a certain number. The lower the number, the more efficient the house is.
Right.
Well, so those are the seminars I've been attending, because it's very difficult to meet the new energy code.
Yeah, traditionally we used to, as a builder, we used to prepare res checks.
Right.
in house, but
I did too.
It's become so complex
Yeah,
now
so
that we
now
don't
you've
even
gotta-
touch
yeah.
it. Yeah.
So for small additions, you can still do the res checks, and I do those in-house because it's relatively straightforward. But for anything larger than 1,000 square foot addition or a new home, you basically have to have a HERS consultant. And Massachusetts right now is probably the strictest state in the nation as far as the energy code goes.
And people, I had this conversation yesterday about these advanced systems and technology and calculations that go into building a home. It's like, I used to joke and call it, it's like building a spaceship. Like 10 years ago, when I think it was about 10 years ago, about 15, when Dartmouth became a stretch code town. And I was joking about like, wow, it's already expensive to build a home. Now they're making it more expensive with insulation, and now it's happening again. It's just, we used to insulate homes for like $8,000. Now it's like $25,000 or more, depending on like if we're using spray foams. But one thing, I wonder what your take is on this. People say, well, why can't we automate construction? Like all these decisions to be made. Why can't, it seems like we're like in the Stone Ages when it comes to being a custom home builder and just the whole process of building custom homes. Why are we so like in the dark ages? And my argument to that is that, you can automate building a car. You're in a factory. It's a controlled environment. You're building the same car over and over again. You can automate those processes. You can offer all these different options, upgrades, what that costs. It's very controlled. But when you're building a custom home, you're in the elements. It's never been done. Yes, you plan first, but at the end of the day, a lot of that quality can be compromised because it's February and you're framing a house and it's 10 degrees outside.
With the wind blowing.
Wind blowing, and there's rain hitting you in the face. And it's not an easy gig at all.
I would say automation, you see some degree of that in the giant home builders. Now, we don't, in the Northeast, at least in this area, we don't have giant home builders like Toll Brothers or Lennar, where they'll build 1,000 home subdivision.
Right.
Where they can, and they're all pretty standard houses. They may have 4 or 5 different styles. They can crank those out, and they probably automate building of the walls and the roof framing in a shop somewhere and deliver it. So that's about as close to automation as you're going to get. But what you get is a pretty standard product.
Standard cookie cutter,
And,
right?
and there's hundreds of them at once. So it makes economic sense to be able to automate it when it's like that.
Absolutely.
But stuff that gets built around here, even large housing subdivisions around here, 20, 30 houses, you don't really see that anymore either.
No.
So the stuff you and I do and most builders around here do are single family custom homes,
Or
custom to one degree.
semi-custom or fully custom, right?
And there's really no automation to that.
None.
And there are modular home builders that, and I've been asked a couple times to participate in, a client comes and they're working with a modular company, and they can do some pretty amazing things with stuff built in their shops.
In their shop. You're still in the elements, though.
You got to put it together outside.
There's no savings, by the way, too. I've done the analysis because I've built a couple modular homes. I wanted to go through it to see the process and learn about it, and versus conventional. And I found no financial benefit.
No real cost.
Didn't cost more, didn't cost less. You still had to bring electricians out, plumbers. You still had those decks, garages. You still had to build those on site.
Yep.
So there was a bit of a quality control. The quality, like millwork wise, may have been a little bit better because it was in a controlled environment. So I do see some small benefits quality wise, but then you have oddities like overly thick walls, partition or joining walls.
Together, sure.
Sometimes irregularities where the floors line up with each other. So I didn't love it, but I'm always interested in advancing. So I've used roof trusses quite a bit. That definitely speeds up the process. In construction. I've entertained panelized walls as well too, shipping out all the walls, and we just place them with equipment to maybe speed things up. But other than that, there's not much that's changed, other than software, that kind of governs the construction project. There's a lot more of that out there. I've been noticing that at the trade shows.
Yeah, I work with a few builders. A lot of the guys I work with are small outfits, so they still do things longhand on sheets of paper,
right?
For budgeting purposes. But there are some that I work with that they're the bigger outfits, and generally you pay for that because they've got to have an in-house team that knows accounting and that can use.
And
the
everyone
software.
charges subscriptions now, so that
exactly.
software is probably cost them $2,500 a month.
Right.
$30,000 a year
Right.
just to have a software.
Right.
You know?
So there are some clients that want to see that. They want to get a breakdown report every month, what everything costs, what all the invoices are, and projections for the next 6 months so they can move their money around. So it's out there. But again, once you're in the field, everything's pretty much, I've done a couple modular concrete foundation walls, which I really wasn't keen on. I don't know that I would do them again, but it was on an island. So it made
okay.
transporting easier than getting concrete trucks.
Right.
On a barge across. So
That's interesting.
yeah, it was an interesting couple projects.
I think about with us, with especially my career as a builder, now that I have a team, a coordinator, I have a project manager, I have a controller that controls the finances of the projects, and thinking back, how did I run six or seven jobs by myself?
Yeah.
With a notepad. Literally, I always joke about my notepad because I'm stuck in that, but it works.
Yeah.
I've heard also said, you can have all these great, Builder Trend and Procore and Timberline. You can have all these great softwares, but you could have this old timer that's been building houses forever with a notepad, and he can
In a
work
white
just
Ford
as efficient.
Econoline van.
Exactly.
Working on his dashboard.
Exactly.
You'll see him at Cumbies
and
every
he can do the
morning.
same as the person using that software. So that's what I love about this industry. It still has an old school touch to it. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's ever going to fully advance. The only way it will be is if it becomes cookie cutter.
Right.
And at the end of the day, you and I my passion is in the artistic side, the custom side.
Yep.
My passion is taking something that never existed before, and that's why I've gravitated towards the build side, because then I get to see it manifest. And I'm sure it's the same reason why you like to be out there.
Yeah,
your design is coming to life.
And my best day is when I had one a couple of years ago where the client kept the house from their kids. They knew they were getting a house built, but they didn't see any of it during construction until it was ribbon cutting day, and they brought the kids in. So you see these 4 kids, their mouths drop when they pull in the driveway and see this brand new house.
Like on TV.
Yeah, and so that makes my day when you see something like that, and the joy in the family when they move in. But I like the creative side. I tell my clients that, you'll never see another one of your houses in the neighborhood or anywhere. Everyone is individual.
Absolutely.
Which a lot of people, that's what they want.
We have a letter we write to our clients when we finish that basically touches on that. Congratulations, you're living in one of the most unique homes in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's big. I want to drive that home with people. That's what we strive to. Yes, I've built some spec homes. Yes, I do that as well too. It's a business at the end of the day. But if I had my choice, it'd be in that realm. It's a good place to be. It's funny, the excitement of when you're framing a house. We have this. It's like this chart. It's called the mood level, the homeowner or client mood level, and we show it to our clients. We just want them to know this is it shows a graph, and it shows the mood climbing very high when the plans are done. Then it kind of waiting for permits. Then it shoots to the top when it's framed and you see the house. Everyone's so excited, but then it just plummets while you're doing systems.
I try and tell people
electrical, plumbing.
Once the framing's done, it's going to slow down.
Then it's like the budgets are coming in, and that's when the mood level really drops. And we really want to set that expectation with the client that this is a real thing. Regardless, if everything runs perfectly, it's still going to feel like this to some degree. But it's interesting. Expectations are important. Do you have that in your business where expectations are ever become an issue?
Yeah.
Or something you have to just kind of be communicative about?
Yeah, the challenge is to always communicate, like any business. I do tell the same thing. I tell people, you get very excited when they break ground because you've been waiting for a long time for something to happen. Now, finally, they're breaking ground. Foundation goes in, and the framing generally goes relatively quickly. There's a lot of product in a fairly short period of time, and I try and tell people, it doesn't always work, that now after framing's done, don't expect to get too excited for a long time, because running wires, running plumbing lines, That's not terribly exciting, but that takes a long time. And it's going to be a long time before you see sheetrock, before you see moldings, before you see your kitchen cabinets. That's the sexy stuff.
The sexy stuff, right? And at that point, you're probably already going over budget,
Yes.
and it's hurting. You might have had to cut back some things.
Yeah.
How do you handle like feedback and criticism from clients or peers, or about your designs, or about what your process?
I would say, for the most part, the biggest fear is my first set of drawings I sent to a client, the initial schematics, because now I've invested energy and time and, my own emotions into putting something together that I really hope they like.
Yep.
So that first hit the computer when I forward a set of schematic drawings and I wait to hear back. Is it going to be happiness? Is it going to be, that's not at all what we're expecting? And that's happened every so often. And then I've got to go into the role of saying, well, it's going to take 2 or 3 hits before we get to something that everybody likes. Because we can sit at a table and wave our hands around and look at pictures, but until you see something on paper, you have nothing to react to.
Right.
So, I mean, it's disappointing when I get feedback that's not positive, where they don't like something.
Right.
But, you suck it up and you go back to the literally go back to the drawing board. That's why that phrase exists.
So we ran into this yesterday. How do you handle when clients drive the design primarily? So like, for instance, we'll have a client that will show up and say, I want the addition to be 16 by 16. It's going to be, you kind of spell the whole thing out. And, my approach is like, let's not worry about the dimensions. Let's not worry about the technical side of it. I try to be simple. What's your wish list? Mm-hmm. What is the things you don't like or don't want? And then kind of encourage our designers to approach it that way, where, we want to offer creative solutions. We don't want you to say, well, we're just going to draw your 16 by 16 bathroom. Well, the bathroom doesn't have to be 16 by 16. It could be a lot smaller. So how do you handle when a client tries to kind of, or inadvertently, I think is more what happens. They don't realize they're doing it. So
a lot of clients jump right away into details: crown moldings, flooring finishes, kitchen designs, the number of faucets in their shower, at the very beginning. And so my analogy that I try and use is the design process is a series of colanders. The first colander has got big holes in it. So that's the big picture stuff. You dump it all in there. The general flow of a floor plan, the overall look of the house. We're not looking at the number of faucets or the number of cabinets. Right. It's the big picture stuff. Once we get through that colander, then we go to the next level of more detailed things. Are the rooms big enough? Do we have enough bathrooms or things like that? And after about 4 or 5 passes through these increasingly smaller holes in the colander, we get to the point now we're ready to talk about some of these finer points. Right. Somewhere in the middle, they may say, that bedroom, I want to put a king-size bed in it, and really not big enough. So then we look at the size of the rooms. Gotcha. But that's not the first thing. I mean, I'll draw up what I think is a reasonable-sized bedroom, reasonable-sized master bath, whatever it is, and put it on the paper. Right. And then we go through a series of steps until we are to the point where now let's talk about the countertops. You want to talk? Countertops, right. Because otherwise, if you start with that stuff in the beginning, I mean, you get lost in the weeds because there's so many decisions. Right. That's a problem that most clients have. They don't really understand the number of decisions they're going to have to make.
We call it selection fatigue, right? So, we're trying to be conscious of that, but we try to be like, we want to make sure, don't send them too much, but we have to stay on track too. We need those decisions to keep the project moving forward.
So what I try and do, and it's worked generally, bathroom fixtures, kitchen fixtures, and things like that are usually big things that hang people up because there's so much out there. Mm-hmm. You can't just send them to a showroom and say, pick stuff, because they'll just get lost. So I will send them catalog cuts of 3 toilets, 3 faucets for this bathroom. So it narrows it down, and it gets us into, I like one of those, I like that, or maybe I don't like any of them, and then we start over again.
Right.
But it sort of really helps them focus. Right. And sometimes clients come to us and they have specific wants. I want this fancy master bathroom shower from Europe or something. Okay, that's fine. But the rest of the stuff, let me help you narrow. Same thing with tiles.
We're currently waiting for a $7,000 freestanding tub from Australia, I believe, right now, which I never would have even thought that
right.
was going to be in this project.
Right.
You know, it wasn't in anywhere, but it's fine.
Yeah.
We're all for it. We're gonna have to install it, unfortunately, after we're done, because we're not going to hold up the whole house for that. But
So I found too, sometimes clients come, selecting some of these European, particularly plumbing fixtures, if they're not certified
Mass
for
code.
Massachusetts,
right, we run into the same thing
send
constantly.
them back, because they
Yeah.
won't accept them.
Hey, I found this on Amazon.
Yeah,
it's with like a third of the price. It's like, yeah, but it's not mass compliant.
Right.
Sorry,
Yeah.
you know.
So there's some of those hiccups that you run into.
How about I had an interesting project where a client didn't want, when we were done with the design, they signed off on the scheme, and then construction plans were complete, and he was his own builder, and he came back. He said, "Oh, you need to change the framing plan." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you used I-joists." I said, "Well, what's wrong with I-joists?" "Well, I don't like I-joists. Those are junk." And I said, "Well, I'm doing right by you. That's the best. That's the best product you should use on this particular, because of the spans."
Yeah.
And so, regardless of, in my best intentions for the client, I moved in that manner. For some reason, that client did not like that product. So, have you ever come across that where a client's like, "I don't want to use this particular product," even though you know better for them?
Yeah. So there's two projects that come to mind. One that's just being finished on the Cape, where the client was very health conscious, didn't want any adhesives in the house,
Okay.
any formaldehyde-based products, any closed cell foam insulation, even to the point where she had analyzed the finishes on doorknobs, because she felt potentially whatever finish they put on it to preserve it from the exterior elements could cause some
Gotcha.
issue. And
That rules out a lot of products.
it rules out a lot of products, and the products you can find, like kitchen cabinets, bathroom cabinets, all were custom made out of wood, no plywood.
Wow.
Because plywood has
Glue.
So the
adhesive.
prices went through the roof.
Right. Even CDX plywood, it's got laminations.
Yeah. Well, and the surprise, so we thought we had eliminated all the issues. All the plywood had to be sealed with a special sealer.
Okay.
So every sheet of plywood got covered with this sealer. And then we had probably a dozen laminated veneer lumber beams, LVL beams, which are engineered beams, installed. And then she saw them, and she was very upset because they have glue in them.
Glue in them.
And she wanted to get rid of them. And they were already installed. And they were clearly on the plans, but we never discussed that that's what they were.
Right.
So we ended up painting all those.
Treating them.
Treating all those.
Gotcha.
And we had one large steel beam in the house. And the concern was that it has some electromagnetic current that it gives off because electrical wires were running alongside of it.
So and to some people that might
we could
sound,
not solve that.
some people
didn't
might
have the
think that's
answer for
crazy,
that one.
but it's not too far off.
Yeah.
VOCs, volatile organic compounds.
Yep.
They're in paint, they're in glues, they're in when you build a house, they're in everything. And these code requirements with energy requirements make us build these houses so tight with weather strippings on the doors or windows that a lot of people have mentioned that they're like sick homes,
Right.
or like call them sick houses, where now you're bringing in energy recovery,
ERVs,
ventilators,
yeah,
ERVs. The bathrooms will have kind of
Every
mini
house
ERVs.
we do has got at least one ERV in them.
So, yeah, if one person gets sick in a house, everyone's getting sick.
Right. And
Probably.
so my fear with these ERVs is they'll work for 10 years, and then sooner or later, they're a piece of machinery they're going to give out.
Give out.
And you won't know until either there's some mold growing in the house or people are getting sick.
Getting sick, right.
So that, to me, is a concern.
And then just a tight house with all those VOCs products, zip. We use zip plywood a lot. That's an OSB product. That's all glue and chips, wood chips. The adhesives on behind the windows. If you want to follow manufacturer's specifications, certain window manufacturers want you to put caulking behind the nail fin. There's the tape, the butyl tape. I mean, there's everything you talk about in the house that's got VOCs. But
So I would say that one was my biggest challenge. And the other issue was she didn't want to use closed cell foam insulation.
okay,
And in the code that house was permitted under, you had to get an R49 in the roof. We typically use 2x10s in the roof, which gives you enough room to get closed cell insulation
Right.
and the rating you need of R49. she wanted to use wool. So there's a company in Indiana called Havelock Wool Insulation,
Okay.
and it's
It
literally
meets that requirement at
well,
that depth, or
not at that depth. So we needed 14 inches of this wool insulation to get to the R49. So we upsized from 2x10s to 2x12s for the roof rafters,
right?
and we put a 2x4 on the bottom
Extension.
of them
Okay.
to get them to 14 inches deep.
Wow.
So we had enough cavity.
And I guarantee you that was not budgeted for that.
Oh, no.
Right.
So that house, you talked about 8,000 used to doing insulating of a house, $160,000
For insulation.
just for insulation. Never mind the 2x12s plus the additional wood added to them.
Right. The painting of the products to seal. I mean, it's
So
probably a lot
that
of
house,
overages.
I mean, probably $500,000 to make it
Compliant.
satisfactory with what she felt she needed for,
Right.
Her interior environment.
Right. And so to piggyback off that question, have you ever had a client kind of insist on a design element that may have not been, appealing?
So there's one house being built as we speak on the Cape, on the water, elevated house because it's in a flood zone, so it's up on concrete piers, and they wanted it to be a contemporary house, which is fine because it, 12 feet in the air.
That's a broad term, though. Contemporary. What's
Well,
contemporary?
Well, she had pictures of contemporary houses, big giant windows,
Yep.
unequal roof pitches, no
Okay.
gables, no gambrels,
Oh, okay.
a flat roof in the middle
Oh, yeah.
with a roof deck, but she had very fixed ideas of what she wanted for windows. And she wanted double hung windows, which are the windows that slide up and down, which is a more traditional window. It really doesn't work with a contemporary modern design. And no matter what I did to try and explain that, she wouldn't have it.
Right. For people listening to this, like contemporary would kind of call for more like a casement window or narrow frame window, narrow frame doors,
Yep.
no grills probably.
No grills.
Not having chunky or heavy frames, and definitely not double hung,
Definitely
which are
not
very
double hung.
traditional New England
So-
colonial.
There was a compromise. The water side ended up with these giant fixed picture windows, 9 foot tall, 4 foot wide, with an awning window below them that can open, hinged at the top, swings out. So the water side, I'm very happy with.
Right.
But the two flanking sides have all these double hungs. The street side has a combination of picture windows and transoms and double hungs, even a sliding window.
Just doesn't.
And it to my eye, it doesn't work.
Right.
And I look back, and my entire career, I managed to avoid clients that insist on things that I know are just not right.
Right.
I've been fortunate in that respect. This one, I don't know, maybe because I'm getting older and less willing to fight over things. This one I let go, and they're happy with it. They like it, which in the end is
that's
the
all-
important thing.
Right.
But boy, if I had it to do over again, I probably would pass on that.
Pass
project.
on it. Right. It's probably not going to make the website or the
No,
portfolio,
no.
unfortunately. But maybe the water
Maybe
side.
the one side will. I mean, it's been a fun project. We have a great builder doing it, but it's a little discouraging.
Yeah.
And the thing with double hung windows is there's what's called a meeting rail in the middle where the two upper and lower meet. So you've got a chunk of obstruction there, and of course, when you're sitting in the sofa looking at the view, it's
right
right in your
there.
view. So it sort of defeats the purpose of being
What-
right on the water.
And to be on the water, I mean, a selling point on a contemporary home would definitely be, with casement windows, because
Yep.
the more the wind pushes, the tighter the seal gets. Versus, I mean, obviously you can get like a high DP rated double hung window, which it will have some protection against that, but you still get
It's not the same.
you
yeah.
still get infiltration. Outswing doors, outswing casement windows, and awnings always perform really well in the water. Yeah. Is there a? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so every so often, I mean, that's one happens to be going on right now. So it's a little discouraging, but it's one of those things.
Absolutely. Can you share an experience where you had to overcome a significant obstacle during a project?
Yeah. So we had a project on the Cape in Falmouth, another custom home in a flood zone. So it's elevated. And every town has a certain height limit that you can build houses to. 35 is the
35
typical.
generally, yeah.
Dartmouth is 35, Fairhaven 35, and Falmouth is 35 as well.
But still only being 2.5 stories.
2.5 stories.
Right. By
And-
definition, so
yeah.
a half stories in that roof
In
line.
the roof.
dormers, and the dormers can't be more than 50% of the floor space.
Yeah, there's a
What-
formula that you've got to meet. So we're designing this house, and in order to get that 35 limit, we have a surveyor, an engineer, that tells us what the grade elevation is before construction. So it's 7 feet, call it. So you can go 35 plus 7, so you're at 42 feet to the top of the ridge, no
Right.
more.
No more.
So the engineer had made a mistake on his initial drawings when he did the survey work. And he said the ground was not 7, it was 8. So I designed the house based on an elevation of 8 plus 35 gets me to 43.
Right. Which now you're at 36 overall.
Well,
height.
so what ended up happening, the thing gets built, engineer comes back to do an as-built survey, and he says, oh, the grade really wasn't 8, it was 7. So now my house is a foot too tall.
Foot too tall.
Now, nobody knows about it except me, the surveyor, and the contractor.
Correct.
So at this point, the house has been framed, sheathed, and the windows are in, but no more, no plaster, no interior work. So we can either risk, well, let's finish it and hope nobody asks for a ridge height certification.
Certification, right?
Although we had a neighbor that was already threatening suit on something else, so that was dicey. Or tell the client we've got to cut the roof off. So we went through a protracted struggle between me, the surveyor, and the builder. Surveyor wouldn't own up to a portion. We were each going to kick in like $10,000 to lower the roof.
I see.
Builder, me, and the surveyor. Because it wasn't the homeowner's fault. It wasn't their issue. But we
Correct.
had to make it right. We weren't going to try and sneak it by. Surveyor wouldn't kick in his portion. So it was my job then to call the owner and say, we've got this problem. First, I had to come up with a design. You just don't cut a foot off the roof and
No.
be done with it. So instead of an A-frame, it became a gambrel. So we
Gotcha.
lowered the top section. I explained to the homeowner the whole problem, and I said, I'm happy to kick in the 10. The builder's going to kick in his 10, but the surveyor doesn't want to do it. 10 is my insurance limit, so I don't want to spend more than that, or I'll go to my insurance company for errors and
Right.
omissions. And she's the best client I've ever had. I've done a number of homes for her over the years. And she said, well, what is this going to cost? And I said, about $30,000. And she said, look, just take care of it.
Straighten it out.
Yeah, and she paid for it,
She paid for it, right?
which, was incredible.
Incredible.
Of someone. So needless to say, I mean, for the rest of the project, I didn't send her any bills or anything because I had a certain responsibility to make it right.
Absolutely.
So that probably was, the worst case I've had in 30 some odd years where there was an error that, we had to own up to,
Right.
somehow make it right. And, of course, at the end of the day, the whole thing gets finished. She loves it. Everybody's happy. And the inspector never asked for a ridge height certification. So we never really knew
Never
if
really
somebody was going to bust us or not. But
Always do the right thing.
right, exactly. So you can sleep at night.
I had a similar story where we pulled up to a job, and the framer over the garage was supposed to be a step down into the room over the garage. So from the exterior, the ridge at the garage was lower than the main house ridge. But when I pulled up, it was all equal. So long story short, the framer misread the plans. This happened. Those guys moved quick.
Yeah.
And they didn't lower that plate height. So I brought to the attention of the developer, because I was building 2 spec homes, but they were custom. And, similar to you, he said, you know what? I was like, listen, the framers will fix it on their dime, and he said, no. Just, I don't want to beat these guys up so bad. Have them fix it. If it's more lumber, whatever, and they can charge me for the time to fix it. And they didn't charge much for it, but it was great to see that on the client perspective. It's rare, but to see the understanding there, because I feel like in the trades, there seems to be a lack of respect there. These guys, a lot of these guys, especially the tile guys, the framers, the roofers, these guys are risking their bodies every day for a paycheck, and it's usually not much. So, but it was great to see that.
Yeah.
That's a great story.
Yeah,
That's a great
yeah.
story. Let me see if I got any other good ones here. I haven't used many of them. This has been just kind of flowing. It's great. How important is it for architects to understand and comply with building codes and regulations? I mean, it's pretty.
It's incredibly important. Again, it's one of those factors you want to be able to sleep at night. knowing that you've done. There's enough times where you screw things up accidentally, but to knowingly not follow the code, you just can't do it. The challenge is keeping up with the codes. We're getting a new code, as of the new year.
This year, yeah.
Actually, it's in place now. It started in October of this year, but you can use the old code until January 1st. Come January 1st, there's the 10th edition of the Mass Building Code coming out.
Right.
And there's a bunch of new changes. One of the biggest ones involves floodplain construction. So now...
What's a big one on that?
There's two flood zones. One is the A zone, where water rises slowly. That's the better flood zone, if there's such a thing. And then there's the V, or velocity zone, where they anticipate wave action, much higher water with moving water. So you have to build much differently in the V zone. So as of now, the FEMA establishes what the top of the waves are expected to be. Call it 17 feet. So
BFE? Would that be the
BFA, base flood elevation.
Right.
So in a certain zone, it might be 17. So the code today says, okay, that's 17. You add 2 feet to that to get to the bottom of your first floor structure.
Which is called freeboard?
Freeboard.
Right.
So even though they figure, well, the waves are only going to come to 17.
Used to be a foot, right? Before?
Used to be a foot. Now it's 2 feet.
That's 2 feet.
So they want a little extra safety margin. So they say 2 feet to the bottom of your floor structure.
Bottom.
Now, come January 1st, it's going to become 3 feet to the bottom of your floor structure. That's the biggest change I've seen. And that what that means in real life is, as I said before, all these towns have a maximum height limit of 35 feet. So you try and squeeze in the floodplain floor, which is the ground floor, which could be 10, 12, 14 feet of open space. You can't do anything but park your cars in.
Mm-hmm.
That takes 15, 17 feet out of your 35. Now you've got 20 feet left to put in a full first floor of living space and maybe some bedrooms on a second floor that are going to have pitched roofs. And maybe a flat pitch on the roof to get underneath that 35-foot ceiling.
It's already a struggle. I've designed a couple and built a couple. It's a struggle just with the 35 and the current.
Yeah.
Or
so now take another foot out of that.
It's gonna kill it. It's funny how rumors get around. They say, I've been hearing, oh, you can't even build in a VE zone now. No, I think that's people's reaction to it. It's
I don't want to build in it.
Yeah, or eventually you're not going to be able to because it's not going to be feasible, or if you're just going to build a one-story house. But who's going to spend $250,000 on a foundation for a one-story house?
These foundations for these V-zone houses, there's only a few contractors in the area that can build them, and they're very expensive.
Very expensive.
To engineer and to build.
To build, right.
And I know the complaint I get, because I've done a bunch of them, is you try and make a traditional looking house sitting 12, 13, 14 feet in the air. You can't, you just can't do it.
It's very difficult.
Very difficult.
You can only dress up those breakaway walls so much.
So Dartmouth, you're still allowed to do breakaway walls, meaning walls built between the concrete piers that under a certain water pressure will break away and float away, and then the water can run underneath the house. Other towns, like Falmouth, they've prohibited breakaway walls. So you can't even do them anymore.
Can't even do those.
You can have 300 square feet or less of enclosed space on your ground floor for a staircase to get up, and maybe some people put in elevators nowadays because humping up 25 steps.
How does a town achieve that sort of is it an ordinance? Like how do they?
So FEMA controls the flood insurance for every municipality in the country, and they write guidelines, and the towns adopt those guidelines if they want the FEMA insurance coverage. And towns can make it stricter than FEMA, and some towns do, like Falmouth. They can add changes to it that make it more strict.
Right.
But generally, most towns say the minimum are FEMA requirements, and there's a 2-inch thick manual of all their requirements.
So it's written into the regulations of FEMA that gives the town autonomy to essentially
make it worse.
Make it worse.
Yeah, make it, at least from my perspective, make it worse. So Dartmouth has probably 7 or 8 amendments to FEMA making it more strict. And one of these new ones is this 3 feet above the base flood elevation.
Wow. I was watching Frank Lloyd Wright talk about some of his projects, and one of the most famous ones I'm sure you know of was Falling Water.
Sure.
Right. I mean, you can never build that today. and you're not going to be able to. I don't think it's ever going to change, and for good reasons too. In a lot of ways, you don't want to disturb these natural resources. I did see another house that was built not by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was on a quarry, and that was different because I think because it was man-made. I think that was more modern times. Yeah. The regulations don't apply to that. Yeah, those are the FEMA thing is a lot. Are they bringing the idea where you have to because we talk about so much work can only occur 50% of the value on one pass. I used to think that could only occur every 2 years, but essentially that was just every permit submittal. Essentially,
right. So,
are they modifying
again,
that?
This is another issue where every town does things differently, and that's what makes it challenging for designers and builders.
Right.
Dartmouth, you can have a permit, close it in the morning, and open a new permit in the afternoon for another segment of work.
Okay.
A second phase. Because one of the things with FEMA is if you spend more than 50% of the assessed value of your existing structure on renovations, you have to bring the entire structure into compliance.
Current code.
So in some towns, you can do 49%, close that permit, come back the next day or that afternoon, open up another permit for the second phase. Other towns don't allow that, and they say any work within a 1-year period or 3-year period is considered one phase.
So there lies my confusion that I've had over the years because
every town is different,
and they're allowed to do that.
They're allowed to do that.
Gotcha.
Because, I mean, quite frankly, it's a bit of a loophole in the FEMA regulations.
Okay.
That isn't closed.
Right.
If FEMA's hearing this, they may change, but I'm actually surprised FEMA doesn't mandate a certain period for phasing. Because a lot of projects we work on, we do in phases, because you don't want to take a 1820s house and lift it 15 feet in the air to comply with.
Right.
There you can get variances, but it's a long, cumbersome process.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go to the state. First you go to the town, they deny you. Then you go to the state for a variance from the floodplain regulations.
Right.
And it's a hit or miss chance that you're going to get a
absolutely. And you have to invest thousands with architects, engineers, consultants, wetland specialists, all these different people involved. The idea of people approach me with the coastal construction. I'm like, that's the most typically what the project we're talking about, like I call the second most challenging, in my opinion. The most challenging residential construction project would be, like you just mentioned, lifting or moving an old house and then placing it on top of a new foundation that meets those requirements. I don't know anything more difficult than that.
Yeah. I mean, we've got one going on now in Nonquit. Thankfully, it's not in a floodplain, but it's an old 1890s mansion that we are lifting up in the air and putting a whole new foundation underneath. It's a fun process to watch, and there's some incredible house movers out there that not a crack in the plaster to lift.
I hope you guys have some time-lapse videos going.
I wonder if we get a lot of pictures. I mean, they have hydraulic jacks and steel beams, and they lift it up in increments.
With the cribbing.
Yep. It's amazing process to watch.
Yeah, I've thought about that there's a lot of great homes in like the West End, downtown districts in New Bedford, that fall into disrepair that, I've often had the idea of like, let's just buy one of these things and move it to like some other setting,
The challenge
maybe
there
someone
is
else would love it.
Taking down power lines and getting the houses through the streets.
The streets aren't wide enough for some of them.
Quickly becomes because we looked at a house on Smith Neck Road that ultimately we tore down for a new house on Smith Neck Road. And the owner was going to give the old house to one of his employees. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful old house, nothing wrong with it, but it didn't fit his needs.
Right.
So he's going to give the house lock, stock, and barrel, but the cost to move it a mile to the new site it was because he had to take down telephone wires and
you just rebuild it at that point for that price.
It got torn down, unfortunately.
Right. Is there a project you that you're particularly proud of?
So there's one. It's the one on Smith Neck Road where this house was torn down ultimately. I like it because it's in my neighborhood and I have to walk past it when I do my walks in the morning. But my biggest fear, sort of as an architect doing work locally, is neighbors see it, friends see it. So you want it to be nice. This particular one is in a very prominent location. Everybody drives past it if they drive down Smith Neck Road.
I think I know what you're talking about, the elevated one on Piers.
No, not that one. It's a few doors down from that.
Oh, I know what house you're talking about. Yep.
But
beautiful.
There's actually two on Smith Neck Road. The first one is the elevated one next to the salt marsh.
And the Gambrel, yours.
So
beautiful.
the one on stilts next to the salt marsh, I did have huge fears about that because when the first columns went up, because it was a concrete stilt house, there were all sorts of comments on Facebook and social media about Stonehenge, and it's going to be horrible, and oh my God, what are they doing?
Right.
And like I say, I live here, so
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to have something that people look at and say, oh my God, he did that.
Right.
So that probably was my scariest one. And then it got finished. And I think most people, with the exception of maybe the immediate adjacent neighbors who no longer have a beautiful view of the water, I think most people think it
Right.
looks fine.
Yeah, and I don't think it's really blocking much. I've been back on
No.
that side over there. I've seen it from the
I mean,
other
if you were a
side.
neighbor, you might feel differently. But
Right.
so that one was scary. But in the end, I think it worked out fine. And then the other one down the road, much bigger house.
Much bigger.
Same thing in that, you have this fear. Is it going to fit in? Is it going to stick out like a sore thumb? And now 2 years later, I think it blends in with the other houses on that street.
I think it just adds to Dartmouth's community. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, that house is beautiful. It's
Yeah.
really well done, and it was executed. I mean, the swimming pool is amazing.
That's in a flood zone, not a V zone. It's in a better flood zone.
Was it AE or something?
It's an AE
Yep.
18 zone. The challenge there was we can't have a basement in an AE zone. So
Okay.
it's slab on grade, no basement. So then you got to find a home for all the utilities, the hot water
Right.
heaters, the boilers, the furnaces,
All
all
of
that
that.
stuff you typically stuff in a basement. So that squeezing that all in and getting it to work properly
Right.
and feed throughout, ductwork. What do you do with ductwork if you can't run it in the basement?
What is that? What do they call that? The high velocity?
So we actually we were able to get away without high velocity. We did heating in the slab, radiant heat in the slab,
Oh, okay.
and then air conditioning from above. So we were able to make it work, but I mean, it was.
Any
it was a
oval? Do
challenge.
you have to use oval ducting at all? No.
Didn't use oval. There may be a couple spots where they did use some high velocity, but we had a good engineer on the job and a great HVAC subcontractor.
Right.
Probably was swearing at the architect a few times. And the guy that had to fit all the equipment into mechanical closets
Right.
throughout the house, there's probably some swearing going on there. But that was a challenge. Having no basement is a big problem. You
Right.
don't think about it until you say, what do I do with all this stuff?
Right. It's such a common requirement
Right.
in our area here is to have a basement
Yep.
for storage or for whatever.
Storage, yeah.
You know, it's almost future space. It's money in the bank,
Yeah.
bonus space. I think I got one more question
Sure.
for you, and I got two questions. So before I ask you this last one, what's kind of like your future goals? Like, you're well established. Are you where you want to be? Do you?
I mean, I think generally I'm further ahead than where I would have ever imagined.
Great.
My wife and I live in a nice house. We have a good life. I can't complain. In architecture, this is one thing I try and tell students that are thinking about architecture. There's generally not a lot of money in architecture. There's a few giant firms. If you want to live in a big city and work for a big firm, unless you're a superstar, you're going to be a cog in a wheel making mediocre money.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a superstar, that's great, and
Yep.
you probably can be very successful. To my mind, the only way to make a reasonable living out of doing this is to go out on your own and start your own company,
Right.
because then you can set the ground rules. It takes a long time to establish yourself, so there are some lean years. For my wife and I, it was probably 10, 15 years of, doing moonlighting wherever we could,
Right.
to make ends meet. And then, so 20 years ago, I was still fearful that, Jesus, are we going to be able to make a living doing this?
Right.
So, sitting where I am now, I'm very happy with the way things turned out. I like working for myself. So I like where I'm at. Future plans, I mean, I've been at it for almost 40 years now. So, I mean, retirement is not that far away.
Right.
I'm 62 now. So I think probably by 65, I'll slow down. Probably don't want to do any more big houses after that.
Okay.
Focus, for another few years doing smaller stuff. Because I don't think I could ever just give it up. I enjoy a lot of it.
There's a book I read. It's the Japanese secret to living a long, healthy life, and it's called Ikigai. And basically, the premise of the book is that no one in these blue zones in the world. The blue zones where people live the longest. You know, they eat small meals. They have community.
I'm out.
They have a passion. You know, and they never retire.
Yeah.
So, you know, or fully retire. They always have something that gets them up every day to a passion. So I always encourage people, especially in artistic fields, like just don't ever stop. Don't ever fully stop.
Yeah.
But as you get older,
No,
you
I
can
definitely I don't have the energy that I used to.
Right.
You know, I used to work weekends and nights and think nothing of it other than getting
Yeah.
some more money in the house to
Right.
make ends meet. I don't think about that. I don't want to work weekends. I
Absolutely.
don't want to work nights anymore. But I think, you know, at 65, I do want to slow down and, you know, pick and choose smaller projects that'll be fun and,
inspiring.
yeah, inspiring.
Yeah.
And don't have anything to do with flood zones and
Yeah.
building code issues and zoning issues.
And that's what we'd hope as we evolve in our careers, to just be able to, you know, pick and choose and work on the projects that inspire us. And this interview is definitely inspiring. And I really appreciate you doing this.
You're
and,
welcome. I appreciate being here.
It's exactly what I thought it would be.
Good.
It was great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, David.
Thanks for coming by.